Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. For tonight, we're going to travel along the mythical spice road. You know that spices are among the first types of goods that were traded long distance in the world. And we're going to discover the peoples and the pioneers who made this possible. Austronesian peoples from Indonesia and the Pacific Ocean since prehistoric times, Indian and Arab traders since antiquity, and closer to us, Portuguese and then Dutch navigators from the age of discovery. I will also explain what these spices are and why they were in such high demand for centuries. To most of our ancestors, spices were luxury items, only accessible to wealthier people, and fantastic legends and tales appeared about their mysterious origins and properties. All of this gives us a lot to discuss tonight, and this journey will take us to multiple places and time periods. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you get less. We let people contribute what they wish to or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to several exclusive episodes, and you can listen to and download all these episodes with or without background sounds. You can participate in polls and also communicate with us directly and provide feedback. And as a token of our appreciation, we offer advance releases to our patrons. We have added links to Patreon as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. But before we begin, let's take a moment together to prepare for our journey ahead. If you'd like, gently close your eyes and let your daily concerns drift away. Find a position that feels natural and cozy. Perhaps make small adjustments until you're perfectly comfortable. Now, draw in a deep, nourishing breath, and as you release it softly, notice how your body responds. Feel the warmth flowing from your neck down through your shoulders, melting away any tension. Let your facial muscles become soft, your jaw loose, your fingers naturally open, and your legs completely at ease. As you settle into this peaceful state, my voice will be your gentle companion as we begin our exploration together. So we're going to explore the spice road, or more exactly, the spice trade, because it never used a single road. The Westerner's spice road evokes the great European discoveries. Galleons returning to Europe with their precious cargo of pepper, ginger, cinnamon, turmeric, cloves, and more. But many of these spices had already reached the Middle East and the Mediterranean world 2 or maybe 3,000 years earlier. long before Europeans opened a new maritime route and took control of the spice trade. The ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they knew and they consumed these spices from East Asia, especially Indonesia. It is unclear whether the Romans knew about Southeast Asia and Indonesia. They knew about China. But already in antiquity, these spices traveled thousands of miles to the Middle East and the Mediterranean Sea. But before talking about how and by whom they were transported, let's take a look at what they are and why they were useful. They are all plants, but different parts of these plants provide what we call spice. Ginger is one of the first spices to have been exported from Asia to Europe. It was already used by the ancient Greeks and the Romans. The plant has a stem, leaves, and it gives flowers too. But the part used as a spice all around the world is the root. It can be used fresh or dry in powder and is really used worldwide as a pickle, to make tea, as a juice for seasoning, in various Asian cuisines, or as a powder to flavor recipes, from gingerbread cookies or even drinks like ginger ale. The plant originated from Indonesia, but it spread after it was domesticated by Austronesian peoples. Austronesians are the vast group of peoples who migrated by sea during prehistoric times, starting about 5,000 years ago. They populated a vast area from Madagascar to Indonesia, Taiwan, Oceania, and many islands in the Pacific. Ginger was first discovered in Indonesia, where it was cultivated alongside other plants, and was subsequently carried by people to various Pacific islands they settled. It was also introduced to regions such as India, Madagascar, and even as far as Hawaii in the Pacific. Now, turmeric is a plant from the same family, and it is also the root that serves as spice. Turmeric is better known as curry. Curry is not a spice. They are dishes or preparations, but their main coloring and flavoring agent is turmeric, and then they include many other spices and plants. Turmeric has a strong coloring power. Actually, it was also used as a dye. Over the centuries, it has turned into a key ingredient in various Asian cuisines, especially in India. Its color in culinary preparations or as a dye is yellow or orange. This is due to a chemical inside the plant called curcumin. Cinnamon is not a root, it's a bark. It comes from several species of trees, and it is the inner bark which is dried. And when it dries, this thin layer curls into little rolls. Cinnamon also reached the Mediterranean Sea and all of the Middle East several thousand years ago. Even the ancient Egyptians had some in 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. But it was extraordinarily precious to them, a real gift for kings, because people had no idea where it came from, and people involved in the spice trade at this time already kept its origins secret to protect their monopoly. This mystery lasted well into the Middle Ages. It remained a secret for several thousand years. Various legends appeared in Europe and around the Mediterranean Sea about the origin of cinnamon. One of them said that the spice was actually fished in the waters near the source of the Nile, which was a secret place deeply hidden in Africa. In reality, it also came from East Asia, from Indonesia. Cinnamon is not hot like many other spices. Actually, it could be, but it's almost always used very diluted in the West, mainly for sweet preparations. So we don't identify it as hot. It is used as flavoring in many different dishes, pastries, and cereals. Pepper or black pepper is native to South India, the region of Kerala. Out of all spices I am mentioning, pepper is probably the king. It is by far the most produced and consumed around the world today, and it is relatively cheap. But it wasn't always the case. Pepper in antiquity was so valuable around the Mediterranean that it could be used as currency. It was sometimes called black gold in antiquity, and it even became a source of concern for politicians and thinkers because it drained the Roman Empire of a large quantity of precious metal, so its use was criticized. The taste for pepper and its high value passed on to the so-called barbarians who conquered the Roman Empire. For example, in the 5th century, the Visigoths besieged Rome and asked for an enormous ransom that included 3,000 pounds of pepper. It remained a luxury item in the Middle Ages, and its trade contributed to the wealth of Italian cities like Genoa or Venice because they controlled the last leg of its trade from the Middle East to Europe. It is said that at the time, pepper could sometimes be worth its weight in gold for the final consumer. There is probably no longer any food item worth that much nowadays. Think about it next time you put a peppermill on your table. This is something basic today, but that was a privilege of kings in the Middle Ages. It is the exorbitant price of pepper, in particular, that pushed the Portuguese to search for a new trade route by the sea in the 15th century. The risk was enormous, and the probability of success appeared small. But the value of the spice made it worth trying. We will talk about that in a moment. Pepper is a fruit from a type of vine. Each fruit contains one single seed. It is called a peppercorn, and it is this fruit, dried, that is consumed as a spice. Generally ground, what we call black pepper is the fruit cooked and then dried. If it is just dried without cooking, it is green pepper. And white pepper is just the seed without the fruit outside. Yet another spice that the Romans knew was cloves. And this time, cloves are flower buds of a tree native to Indonesia. Again, more specifically, the Moluccas. The Moluccas are a group of islands within Indonesia, and they were nicknamed the Spice Islands by Europeans because they produced a variety and quantity of spices they could only have dreamed of before discovering them, and in some cases, spices that were exclusive to these islands. Cloves are also a flavoring ingredient very popular in Asia, in the Middle East and in Africa. In the Middle Ages, they were sought after in Europe to flavor meat. Nowadays, they are often included in spice mixes. Apart from cloves, the Moluccas also produced nutmeg, another spice that turned very popular after European ships established routes to Indonesia. There are many more examples of spices, and their trade was not just with the Middle East and Europe. That was just the longest route. China also traded for thousands of years with Indonesia and India, and was a big buyer of ginger and pepper. It is hard to know exactly when India and Indonesia started to export spices. Ancient Egyptians already knew different spices from India that arrived from Arabia. But even long before, in the Neolithic period, there is evidence of trade in and around the Middle East, sometimes on long distances, several thousand miles, in valuable goods like precious stones, obsidians, seashells, and spices. At the end of Egypt, as an independent country, during the Ptolemaic period, this was before Egypt became a Roman province, the country traded with India through ports on the Red Sea. But the first to open a maritime trade network in the Indian Ocean, connecting the Middle East with Indonesia, were the Austronesian peoples from Indonesia that I mentioned before. They built the first ocean-going ships we know of thousands of years ago, in the second millennium BC. These were not very impressive ships based on our modern standards. They were small catamarans, that is to say, boats featuring one or two lateral support floats on each side of the hull. A catamaran has two hulls. When there is a single hull, it is an outrigger boat. So the Indonesians from various islands in Indonesia established this network that brought them westward to Madagascar, that they colonized in the first centuries AD, and they also reached India, East Africa, and Arabia by sea. The rest of the journey was made in antiquity by Arabs, Phoenicians, and Indian traders, bringing the products to their end destination. And there was a sea route in the Red Sea and a land route in the Arabian Peninsula. This activity generated a lot of wealth for Arab tribes that controlled it, or for Phoenician cities. The ancient Greeks were perfectly aware of this. They didn't know where the spices came from, but they knew that they transited via Arabia and the Red Sea. And this region was actually on a list of lands to conquer by Alexander the Great, even though he never conquered it. When the Roman Empire replaced every other state around the Mediterranean Sea, Roman traders took control of the last leg of the trade. But even though a few Romans traveled in the Indian Ocean and they reached India and China, the longest segment of the route stayed in the hands of Indian and Indonesian and increasingly Arab traders, or more generally, Muslim people after the rise of Islam. The Persians also got involved in this trade. In the first centuries of Islam, trading with the East, with India and Indonesia, contributed to a lot of the wealth of the Abbasid Caliphate. At its greatest extent in the ninth century, the Abbasid Caliphate was an empire that covered most of the Middle East and North Africa. After that, it declined and fragmented into various states. The capital was Baghdad, and from the port of Basra, also in present-day Iraq, sailors and merchants sailed south and east and came back with valuable spices. This exploration inspired tales and legends like that of Sinbad the Sailor. Islamic merchants made spices like nutmeg and cinnamon famous and sought after in the Middle East. Quite early, the maritime routes to India and Indonesia fell into the hands of Arab traders from Oman and Yemen. They knew how to reach the Far East, and they kept this secret preciously. They even reached the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and most spices that later reached Europe via Venice or other Italian cities had to travel through them. Now, the journey from Indonesia to Arabia was not in a straight line. It was too far. Spices from the Moluccas were shipped to trading emporiums on the coast of India or Sri Lanka. They would often change hands, and their price would increase there. Indian demand was also important, and then what had not been sold in India was shipped to Oman or Yemen or East Africa. Local authorities benefited a lot from this trade. They taxed all cargo. These taxes or these tributes paid were often paid in products, spices, or other precious items like incense or sandalwood. And the value of spices increased again, dramatically, between the entry ports and exit ports like Alexandria. The last leg of the journey to Europe was another monopoly during the Middle Ages. Italian maritime republics, especially Venice, controlled this trade almost entirely. They traded in spices, but not only. There were many other products reaching the Middle East via other routes like silk, opium, gems, and this trade made Venice fabulously rich in the Middle Ages. Even though the Venetians bought products that already had had several huge markups on their way up to Alexandria or other Muslim ports, they were still able to apply another very comfortable markup to their benefit. The position of Venice was very lucrative and stayed so for several centuries, but it could sometimes be unstable because the Venetians had to buy from Islamic traders, and they didn't know where the products came from. They also depended on a long route that wasn't in their hands, and sometimes this road could be interrupted, prompting a crisis for Venice. It happened in the 11th century, and even more in the 15th century. When the Ottomans finished Byzantium by conquering Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire expanded to most of the eastern Mediterranean and denied the Venetians access to spices. They took control of the route to their benefit, especially through the taxation of spices, as all possible routes had to go through the Ottoman Empire. They were in a good position to extract value and make the Europeans pay an even higher price, because even though spices were an expensive product, a luxury, European demand was high and growing throughout the Middle Ages. But why pay so much for a product which, after all, is not a basic need? There are several explanations for this. First, the medical reasons. The dominant medical theory in medieval Europe was humorism. So, what is it? What is humorism? Our ancestors had quite a different understanding of the human body than we have. They believed, and this vision was very ancient, it dated back from ancient Greeks and Romans. They believed that there were humors regulating human behavior. Humors being bodily fluids like blood, phlegm, or bile. When people had a moderate imbalance between these humors, this could affect their behavior or their mood. There are terms that still today reflect this ancient belief. When someone is said to be bilious or phlegmatic or sanguine, so imbalances could affect behaviors in their view and strip people of their reason. But an extreme imbalance was also a symptom, or according to some, a cause of illnesses. So good health was seen as a state of correct balance between these humors, between these substances, and doctors elaborated and believed in theories about that. Any particular disease would be the product of excess or lack of a particular humor. And the humors could also be corrupted by the environment or a change in diet. How is it important to spice consumption? Because it was believed that spices contributed to balance humors. They were not the only option. There were other remedies for people who didn't have the means. But spices had and kept a very powerful, healthy image all through the Greco-Roman antiquity and then during the Middle Ages. They were not only used as drugs, but also as what we could call a superfood today, something that keeps people healthy. This belief was very powerful. It was an ancestral belief. And even though we now know that it didn't particularly help cure anything, it went unchallenged for centuries. Actually, some spices have medical properties. For example, ginger is a quite powerful antiseptic. And maybe these properties helped establish the healthy aura around spices, because up to a point they can alleviate pain or reduce symptoms, but they are no longer seen scientifically as effective drugs. But it is only in the 16th century that humorism started to be questioned in Europe, and it didn't even kill it. Well into the 18th century, it was still very present in European medicine. From this medical system came practices like bleeding the patients or putting hot cups on their back. The cups were supposed to drain bile to rebalance humors, and bleeding was a way to eliminate blood from their system. Physicians had observed that bleeding someone could make a fever go down, and it does. But this is because fever is a symptom, not the disease itself. The body increases its temperature when it is fighting an infection or a virus. When a person is bled, it weakens the body, and this is why the temperature goes down. But all it does is actually increase the risk that the situation becomes worse because the body is less armed to fight. So, medicine and health concerns were a reason for the demand for spices, and not only in Europe. The same conceptions existed in the Islamic world or under different forms in traditional medicine in India or China. Another reason for the demand was the aristocracy, or the elite in general. It became fashionable to use spices in wine or cooking for taste, of course, but also as a distinction mechanism because it was expensive and a sign of status. There are old recipes from the Middle Ages that contained more spices than we would ever think of putting into a dish. They were fashionable, and they remained so for generations. In a sense, they entered the same paradox as other luxury goods. They are expensive because they are in high demand relative to the supply available and the cost of bringing them to consumers. But it also worked the other way around. The high price gave them a status that could push up demand instead of reducing it, at least from wealthy clients. So that was the situation at the end of the 15th century. Spices were more expensive than ever. The Ottoman Empire, and more broadly the Islamic world, had controlled access to them for Europeans for a very long time already. And some Middle Eastern and Asian traders were making a fortune out of their control of the spice road. But this was about to change, and the world trade would dramatically shift in the 16th century. The precursors here were the Portuguese. Like Spain at the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese were willing to explore the seas and discover new routes to India and East Asia. It is well known that Christopher Columbus reached the new continent, America, as he was sailing westward, hoping to find China or India. But the first Europeans to actually reach India and China entirely by sea were the navigators from Portugal. The story of the exploration of the Portuguese navigators in the 15th and 16th centuries is really very impressive. Portugal had a long maritime tradition. It existed as an independent Christian kingdom since the end of the first millennium, and being at the extreme west of Europe, with a long coast on the Atlantic, it was destined to be looking towards the ocean. During the late Middle Ages, Portuguese sailors explored the coasts of Africa, progressively adventuring further and further south. They couldn't know it yet, but the following generations of Portuguese navigators would create a global empire in just a few years. And that's impressive when we consider that Portugal was such a small country. It had just about 2 million inhabitants back then. Most of them were peasants or fishermen. The sailors were maybe just a few thousand, and these few thousand men would conquer or create trading posts from Brazil to China, including in Africa, India, and Indonesia. This sudden emergence of Portugal as the first ever global trading nation didn't come from nowhere either. A central figure in the early days of the Portuguese Empire was Prince Henry the Navigator. He is regarded as the main initiator of the Age of Discovery for Portugal. He lived in the first half of the 15th century, decades before the Portuguese reached the Indian Ocean. Prince Henry was the fourth child of a king of Portugal, King John I. But what he is known for is that he spurred and organized a systematic exploration of Western Africa and the Atlantic Ocean by Portuguese navigators. The basis for this project was his fascination with Africa and legends. Portugal was regularly at war with the Muslim states in the south of Spain until Spain finished the conquest of the whole peninsula, and also in North Africa, Morocco especially. In 1415, when Henry was 21, Portugal conquered the port of Ceuta on the coast of Africa in front of Gibraltar. With this Portuguese presence in North Africa, he learned about trade routes across the Sahara, and he became fascinated with Africa in general. Africa to him looked like a mysterious and gigantic land. Nobody knew where it ended, and there was also a well-known legend in all of Christian Europe about a mysterious Prester John that also had a huge influence in Henry. Prester was a legendary king who would have ruled a mysterious Christian kingdom beyond the Muslim world. For medieval Christian Europeans, this Muslim world represented all they knew south and east of their land. This mysterious kingdom would have survived the Islamic conquest and thrived somewhere in the east or the south. Some accounts place the kingdom in India or in Central Asia after the arrival of the Mongols. Over time, the legend was embellished with extraordinary wealth in this kingdom. Marvels, unknown creatures. What may be the origin of this legend is the survival of Christian communities within the Muslim world. There was a degree of tolerance most of the time, even though they could be discriminated against. But Christian communities did survive for centuries within Muslim states, and so did the Kingdom of Oriental Rite in Ethiopia. Actually, when the Portuguese reached Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa, they believed it was Prester John's kingdom. But a century before that discovery, Prince Henry was already intrigued, fascinated by this legend, and together with trade expansion and curiosity, it was yet another reason to send expeditions to explore the world. Henry's work consisted of sending expeditions, organizing the mapping of the world, and sponsoring discoveries in anything related to navigation in general. These expeditions consisted of one or two small ships that would follow the coast of Africa. Mostly the type of ship that was used was called the caravel. These expeditions led to several breakthroughs. The Portuguese discovered that the coast of West Africa extended very far south of Gibraltar, and they also learned a lot about the patterns of wind in the Atlantic, which at the time was crucial to travel a long distance. Winds blow consistently from the east around the equator and from the west in the mid-Atlantic. The Portuguese discovered this, and they learned to use these winds to travel farther, even though it sometimes meant they would initiate their journey sailing in the opposite direction to their destination. This was a way of catching the winds and going faster, so they didn't travel in straight lines. And during the large turns they made in the Atlantic Ocean, they very probably reached the coast of Brazil several decades before Columbus reached the Caribbean. It wasn't remembered as a rediscovery of America because they didn't claim the land nor settle there. They did it, but later. But they most probably reached South America in the 15th century, before Columbus. At least they knew there was a land there southwest of Portugal. It is under Henry's supervision that the Portuguese created their first colonies, starting with Madeira in 1420, then the Azore Islands in the middle of the Atlantic, and maybe more importantly, they ventured south of a limit in the African coast called Cape Bojador. Until Henry's time, this point was the most southerly known to Europeans along the coast of Africa. Among Portuguese sailors, it had acquired a legendary aura. It was feared that beyond Cape Bojador, beyond that point, sea monsters were waiting for them, or that they would reach the edge of the world. Cape Bojador is located south of Morocco, not that far south from Portugal, actually. But in 1434, a courageous navigator sent by Henry, Gilles Inez, pushed beyond it, and he returned safe to Portugal. From this moment on, new expeditions constantly went further south, and Portuguese started elaborating the first European maps of the African coast. They reached the peninsula of Cape Verde in 1444, and they founded another colony in the Cape Verde Islands. Beyond this point, they realized that the desert ended, the Sahara ended. They crossed the southern edge of the Sahara and set up trading posts, marking their initial challenge to the Muslim dominance over the trans-Saharan trade. Slaves and gold from Africa started to arrive directly in Portugal by the middle of the 15th century and already made the country wealthier. The maps and the navigation information were kept secret and shared with as few people as possible because they were extremely valuable back then. They had been expensive and risky to acquire, and now that they could be turned into a monopoly, an actual wealth, they were certainly not going to let them go. This secrecy around maritime maps went on to last for centuries. Until the 18th century, European nations, first Spain and Portugal, then England, France, and the Netherlands, kept the maps drawn by their own expeditions as strategic information. So the Portuguese kept pushing south for decades until another navigator, Bartolomeu Dias, reached the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. And in 1498, 6 years after Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea, sailing all around Africa. At this point, the Portuguese had created various trading posts around Africa, and the news that Christopher Columbus had claimed a new land in the west that he initially thought to be India had already arrived in Portugal. But the Portuguese strongly suspected it couldn't be India. It was far from Spain, but still way too close to be India. And whereas the Spanish explored towards the west, they kept searching for a trade route towards the east, south of Africa, establishing a spice trade with the Far East and India had become their main objective when they understood that the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire could be bypassed by navigating around Africa, and it worked. In India, Vasco da Gama discovered a pepper market where he would buy at a fraction of the cost at which pepper was offered in Venice and in huge quantities. At the same time, entirely new spices were introduced to Europe thanks to America, including chili peppers and vanilla. They all came from this continent, but the business of traditional spices, including pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, fell into the hands of Portugal in just a few years at the beginning of the 16th century. In 1511, just 12 years after the Gamas' arrival in India, they had already established trading posts, generally by conquest, violently, on the island of Socotra, at the entrance of the Persian Gulf, on the coast of India, and they took possession of Malacca. Malacca was close to Indonesia, and by then it was the center of Asian trade. Based in Malacca, they searched for the origin of spices, and they found the secret location of the Spice Islands, where they were the first Europeans to arrive in 1512. From this moment on, the Portuguese had the control of spices from their place of origin to Lisbon in Europe, a monopoly that no one had ever had in various millennia of spice trade. This monopoly was not earned peacefully. Military expeditions were sent to capture strategic points and systematically deny access to Arab traders. There were various battles. The Portuguese used diplomacy and negotiation with local states when they could, but they also threatened and conquered their way into the spice trade. They didn't limit this activity to spices, and they kept exploring East Asia, reaching China and Japan. This trade route with Africa and Asia generated a considerable wealth for Portugal in the first half of the 16th century. It is hard to measure how much exactly, but because it was a small country, it probably had by far the highest income per capita in the world back then. Of course, it stayed in a few hands only, and a lot of this wealth was lost later. But there are still traces of Portuguese trade empire around the world. The status of Macau in China, which was similar to Hong Kong before it was given back to China. Enclaves in Indonesia like Timor, it remained separate from Indonesia for a long time before finally being annexed. Of course, the Portuguese language in Brazil, but also in the various African countries like Angola or Mozambique or the islands of Cape Verde, are also remains of this empire. There is architecture too in Portugal. As part of this new wealth, the Portuguese kings and nobles funded the construction of fortifications, palaces, and religious buildings. The new Portuguese spice road made spices much more affordable in Europe, even with a huge markup. Products were still considerably cheaper than they were when Venice sold them. So it contributed to increased consumption, and it also had consequences for the old states that benefited from the ancient road. Venice was now cut from the new global trade axis, and its decline accelerated in the 16th and the 17th centuries. The Ottoman Empire also suffered from the loss of a big source of taxes, of income, for the state, but not that severely. It had a much more diversified economy and diversified resources, and its might was not just financial and maritime like Venice. Actually, the Ottoman Empire reached its peak after the spice trade had declined for them. Portugal kept shining and benefiting from its explorations for about 2 generations, and then it began to decline. First, because of its bigger neighbor, Spain. The Spanish also established their own spice road 20 years later, but by the west, they were the first to launch an expedition that completed a journey around the globe. The Magellan Expedition. Magellan was Portuguese, but he worked for the crown of Spain. He died during the trip, but the ships reached the Philippines from America, crossing the Pacific Ocean, and then they returned to Spain through the Indian Ocean and the west coast of Africa, just like the Portuguese returned to Lisbon in their expeditions to Asia. Spain colonized the Philippines. Actually, this is why they are called the Philippines, after Philip II of Spain. And they put in place a convoy system through the Pacific Ocean that reached Panama or Mexico. Then the goods were carried by land to the other coast and sent to Spain across the Atlantic. The Spanish found the Spice Islands about 10 years after the Portuguese, and even though the Portuguese route remained more active and more cost-effective because it was shorter, Spain began to compete with Portugal on the spice market for Europeans. But the biggest blow to Portugal's might in the 16th century was when the two countries ended up in a personal union. King Philip of Spain also became the King of Portugal, and the two countries never merged. They just had the same king. But Portugal was now used to serve Spain's interest and was dragged into European wars. It no longer had its own foreign policy, and after that, the Portuguese Empire declined when more nations arrived and the global trade and colonization came. In the 17th century, England, Netherlands, France began to replace Spain and Portugal as the new colonial nations. Portuguese trading posts were targeted, especially by the Dutch. They captured some of them and effectively replaced Portugal as the main trading nation with East Asia, and also colonizing Indonesia and the Spice Islands. Overall, the spice trade became less profitable from the 17th century onwards for European traders. Spices had dropped significantly as spices were now more readily available, and there were plenty of new colonial products that also became fashionable: sugar, tobacco, cocoa, tea, coffee. The cultivation of precious spices was also disseminated to countries like India or Sri Lanka, and more islands in Indonesia, and this made supply more and more abundant. Since this time, prices have dropped and dropped until today, when spices are no longer a luxury. They have become basic items in grocery stores, and most people consume them almost daily, including in relatively poor countries. Portugal was marginalized as a trading nation in the Indian Ocean by trade companies sponsored by other European nations in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Portugal tended to focus increasingly on the development of Brazil. These East Indian companies were absorbed by their governments in the 18th and 19th centuries, and colonization around the Indian Ocean and Asia became systematic. Various European states sponsored spice production in their colonies: the UK in India or Malaya, Spain in the Philippines, France in Madagascar or Indochina, the Netherlands in Indonesia, and Indonesia remained a big spice producer in the world since then. Other big producing countries include India, Vietnam, or China nowadays. The time of explorers, small production, dangerous long haul travel is over. Spices are traded easily and safely around the world. So, in this sense, the spice road has now disappeared. In daily life, spices have lost the kind of mysterious and luxurious aura they had for our ancestors. But their appeal was one of the reasons behind the emergence of early global trade, with all of its consequences, good and bad. It had consequences on local populations, on wars, on forced labor and slavery. But it also contributed to spread knowledge, to cultural exchanges, wealth creation, and changes in consumption patterns. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. You can now let go and sleep, or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.